In 876, Japan crowned a boy barely 7 years old. He did not yet know law, diplomacy, or mercy, only that a single word from his lips could decide life or death. His name was Sadami, later Emperor Yōzei. Within 8 short years, the Chrysanthemum Throne would become a stage for blood, fear, and chaos. And its child ruler would be remembered not for glory, but for the madness that devoured him. Sadami entered the world on the 10th day of the first month in the year 869. In an age when the Heian court glimmered with the delicate beauty of painted screens and the weight of hidden rivalries. His birth, not merely the arrival of another royal child, but the sealing of an alliance between 2 towering pillars of Japanese authority. His father, Emperor Seiwa, a direct descendant of the divine line stretching back to the sun goddess Amaterasu herself, and his mother, Fujiwara no Takaiko, a daughter of the most influential aristocratic clan in the land, whose sprawling network of kinship and political calculation wound through the imperial court like invisible threads guiding every movement of the nation. From the first breath he drew beneath the painted rafters of the palace, Sadami's identity was defined not by his own will, but by the interplay of forces greater than any child could comprehend. For in his veins ran both the sacred blood of emperors and the calculating heritage of the Fujiwara. 2 currents destined to pull in harmony so long as their interests aligned, and to tear apart everything in their path should they ever diverge. The court chroniclers would later note, with a tone both reverent and cautious, that his arrival was greeted not only by ceremonial offerings to the gods, but also by a quiet, satisfied murmur among Fujiwara elders. For the boy was more than a prince. He was the embodiment of a strategy decades in the making. His father, Emperor Seiwa, though still young himself, was a figure of austere dignity, bound by the rituals and responsibilities of the Chrysanthemum Throne. A man whose every gesture was measured against the weight of centuries, yet even he could not wholly escape the influence of his wife's clan. For the Fujiwara were not merely courtiers, but kingmakers, wielders of a subtler kind of power that did not need the throne in order to control it. His mother, Takaiko, was of a different mold, graceful in public, watchful in private, a woman whose upbringing had trained her to see every gesture at court as a move in a game where affection was a currency, loyalty a rarity, and advantage the only prize worth keeping. From the moment Sadami was placed in her arms, she knew, perhaps even before he could open his eyes, that his life would never belong entirely to himself. For he was the bridge between 2 legacies, and bridges, however grand, exist to be crossed, used, and sometimes burned when they no longer serve their purpose. The early years of his childhood, though softened by the trappings of imperial luxury, were shaped by this dual heritage. Mornings filled with gentle tutors who instructed him in poetry, music, and the art of calligraphy. Afternoons overshadowed by the presence of high-ranking courtiers whose eyes lingered on him with an intensity that was less affection than assessment, as though they were measuring the contours of a future weapon. In the palace gardens, where plum blossoms fell like fragments of pale silk upon the stone paths, Sadami learned to walk between 2 worlds, one of childlike wonder, chasing the darting flash of koi beneath the pond's surface, and one of unspoken scrutiny, where every slip of the tongue could be noted and remembered by servants, loyal not to him, but to the factions that surrounded him. The court, in those days, was a place of elegance concealing unease, where the scent of incense masked the staleness of intrigue, and where the Fujiwara's grip over imperial succession was both an open secret and a silent threat. Even before he could read, he had already learned the language of glances exchanged over low tables, of silences stretched just long enough to signal disapproval, of praise offered not because he had pleased, but because he was expected to be pleased. The Chrysanthemum Throne loomed in his future, not as a distant dream, but as an inevitability. The boy was too young to imagine refusing it, and too watched to imagine escaping it. It is tempting, looking back, to imagine that these early years might have been different had his father been a man of unshakable independence, or his mother a woman who valued the simplicity of family over the security of political dominance. But history rarely grants such mercy to those born into its most gilded cages. Instead, Sadame's days unfolded beneath the double gaze of the emperor, who saw in him a continuation of divine rule, and the mother who saw in him a continuation of Fujiwara influence, each shaping him in ways neither would fully understand until the consequences had already begun to spill into the world beyond the palace gates. The capital, Heian, was itself a city built on dualities, temples of profound serenity rising beside streets crowded with merchants and beggars, poetry contests held within the same walls where whispers of treachery passed from mouth to ear like drifting smoke. And in such an environment, the boy learned early that beauty and danger often occupied the same space. The Chrysanthemum Throne was not only the symbol of imperial authority, but also the center of a labyrinth where loyalty was fluid, alliances were temporary, and every rise in power cast a shadow deep enough to hide a blade. By the time he reached his 6th year, the court was already treating him less as a child and more as an heir in waiting, instructing him in the elaborate ceremonies that would define his public life while quietly preparing the machinery that would control him in private. Every step he took toward the throne was matched by a step deeper into the coils of Fujiwara influence. For the clan had perfected the art of ruling from behind the curtain, placing sons-in-law, nephews, and grandsons in positions of prominence until the emperor himself became only one player in a game whose true master sat unseen. And so it was that in the winter of 876, when Emperor Seiwa, citing ill health in the council of his advisors, announced his abdication, there was no public outcry, no open contest for the succession, no question as to who would take his place. The court, the city, and the empire turned their gaze toward the boy, born of two powers, unaware, or perhaps unwilling to admit, that in crowning him, they were not merely placing a child upon the throne, but setting into motion a chain of events that would turn the imperial palace into a theater of fear, and his reign into a cautionary tale still whispered in the shadows of history. When the winter of 876 settled over Heian, muffling the city's clamor beneath a veil of cold mist, the imperial palace became the stage for a spectacle as intricate as any poem and as dangerous as any political coup. For inside the hall of state, beneath the painted ceiling where cranes flew forever in silent arcs, a boy of 7 was dressed in robes far too heavy for his small frame, their layered silks pooling at his feet like the weight of centuries gathering around him, while courtiers moved with rehearsed precision, adjusting the tilt of his crown, the set of his sleeves, the very angle of his head, so that when he was led to the Chrysanthemum Throne, the image presented to the assembled ministers would be one not of innocence, but of divine inevitability. The abdication of Emperor Seiwa, though announced with the formal pretexts of declining health and the guidance of ancestral spirits, was in truth the result of a careful orchestration by those whose power depended on the emperor's compliance. And in this, the Fujiwara had proved once again their mastery of subtlety, ensuring that the throne would pass not to a rival faction's candidate, nor to a seasoned ruler who might resist their influence, but to a child who could be shaped, contained, and, should the need arise, removed without plunging the court into civil war. In the official records, the ceremony was flawless. The transfer of sacred regalia, the recitation of oaths, the kneeling of nobles before their new sovereign, all performed with the grace of a nation steeped in ritual. Yet beneath the layer of incense smoke and polished formality lay an unspoken understanding that this was not the coronation of a ruler in his own right, but the installation of a figurehead whose youth was the very guarantee of his manipulability. From the moment Sadami, now Emperor Yōzei, was seated upon the golden throne, the palace adapted itself around him like a vine wrapping around a newly placed pillar. The schedules of the court restructured to account for his lessons in etiquette, his audiences with selected officials, and the ceremonies in which his presence was required to lend legitimacy to decisions made by others. He was taught to read imperial decrees before he was taught to read the histories behind them, to recite prayers to the kami before he was encouraged to question why they were invoked in times of state, and to sign his name upon edicts whose meaning he did not yet understand. The regents, most of them Fujiwara by blood or marriage, spoke for him in council, framed policies in language that made them appear to be his will, and gently reminded him, always with the tone of benevolent guardians, that a true emperor did not trouble himself with the mundane mechanics of governance. For his role was to embody the harmony of heaven and earth, not to dirty his hands with the disputes of men. And yet, while they cloaked their control in the language of protection, the boy absorbed the reality that the words he spoke could alter the course of lives beyond the palace walls. That a nod or a shake of his head could bring prosperity to one province and famine to another, and that his mere signature could mean the difference between a man walking free and a man awaiting execution. The days of his early reign were marked by an almost theatrical routine. Mornings beginning with the presentation of petitions, whose contents he barely skimmed before his advisors murmured the proper responses into his ear. Afternoons spent in the long shadowed corridors of the palace where his tutors lectured him on the divine origins of the imperial house. The unbroken line of succession that stretched back to the dawn of time, and the sacred duty he bore to preserve the stability of the realm. In these teachings there was truth, but also a subtle distortion. For the stability they spoke of was less the peace of the empire and more the continued dominance of the Fujiwara network that had placed him on the throne. It is easy to imagine him, in those first years, believing in the grandeur of his position without yet comprehending its limitations, mistaking the bows of ministers for genuine reverence, the deference of courtiers for loyalty rather than necessity, and the careful choreography of his public appearances for evidence of his own majesty, when in reality he was moving through a world constructed for him, each step anticipated, each word measured, each gesture anticipated by those who had long ago decided how an emperor should behave. Beyond the inner palace, the city was watching with curiosity rather than alarm. For the people of Heian had seen child emperors before, had witnessed regents guiding the affairs of state in the name of young sovereigns. And so Yōzei's accession did not strike them as a dangerous anomaly. Yet, within the corridors where decisions were made, there was already a quiet vigilance, a subtle awareness that the boy who now wore the imperial crown was not simply a vessel to be filled with courtly virtues, but a living will that might, in time, turn upon those who sought to shape it. The Fujiwara understood that children grow, that minds, however tender, begin to form their own judgments. And so they worked diligently to cultivate in Yōzei a sense of ceremonial detachment, to keep him insulated from the raw human realities of the empire, to ensure that the world he saw was filtered through the lenses they held before his eyes. They did not yet see the danger in teaching him that commands need not be justified, that decrees need not be questioned, and that the lives of those beneath him were as interchangeable as the figures in the painted screens that adorned his chambers. In the golden light of late afternoons, when his lessons were done and the formalities of the day relaxed. Yōzei would wander the palace gardens, accompanied by attendants who kept their distance but never their eyes from him. And it was in these moments, away from the oppressive weight of ceremony, that the first signs of curiosity about the nature of power began to stir. He would ask questions about why certain men no longer came to court, why punishments were necessary, why the world beyond the palace gates seemed both fascinating and forbidden. And though the answers given to him were always wrapped in the silken language of tradition, they did not always satisfy him. Thus, the boy who had been placed on the throne as a symbol of harmony was already, in the quiet chambers of his mind, beginning to wonder what it might mean to act outside the scripts written for him, to discover for himself the full extent of the authority that had been handed to him before he could even count the years of his own life. And in that wondering, unnoticed or underestimated by those around him, lay the seed of a reign that would soon shift from the gentle pageantry of a child ruler to the unpredictable theater of a sovereign who had learned, far too early, that the line between divine right and human impulse could be dangerously thin. It began not with a proclamation, nor with a dramatic clash in the council chamber, but with something so seemingly small that many of those present at court did not notice its significance until much later. A boy emperor, restless in the middle of a long and ceremonious afternoon audience, waving away the droning voice of a petitioner and without seeking the customary whisper of guidance from his regent, ordering the man removed from his sight. A gesture so quick and so dismissive that it might have been mistaken for childish impatience. Yet it carried with it the force of imperial authority. And the man, bowing low but trembling, was led away by guards whose obedience was automatic, for the words had come from the mouth of the sovereign himself. In that moment, Emperor Yōzei learned something his tutors had never intended to teach so soon: that he could speak without first listening, command without first justifying, and that his orders, no matter how sudden or personal, would be carried out as though they were decrees descending from the heavens. The regents, though startled, allowed it to pass without correction, perhaps believing it was harmless to indulge him in one small display, perhaps fearing that a public rebuke would tarnish the aura of authority they had so carefully built around him. But whatever their reasons, the lesson he absorbed was clear. The throne did not require permission to act, only the will to speak. What began as a single, unmediated command soon found echoes in other moments, first in trivial matters, a change in the order of the day's procession, a refusal to meet an envoy deemed boring, the sudden replacement of a favored attendant with another whose smile pleased him more. But gradually, these exercises in preference slid toward exercises in dominance. At first, the boundaries he tested involved animals kept in the palace gardens. There are accounts in court diaries of Yōzei ordering the capture and killing of birds whose cries irritated him during his afternoon rest, or demanding that hunting dogs be released to chase deer within the imperial grounds so that he might watch the chase from a veranda. The scene unfolding like a living tapestry woven from movement, sound, and the final stillness of the prey. For the courtiers who attended these spectacles, the proper response was to smile faintly, to murmur approval of the emperor's vigorous spirit, and to pretend not to notice the unsettling intensity with which he observed the moment when life fled a creature's eyes. To criticize openly would have been to risk his displeasure, and to risk his displeasure was to court danger. For by now the boy had learned that punishments, banishments, confiscations, even the quiet removal of a name from the rolls of those permitted at court, could be delivered with nothing more than a flicker of his attention in the wrong direction. Some chroniclers suggest that this fascination with control over life and death was, at first, little more than the natural curiosity of a young mind, raised in an environment where cause and consequence were separated by ceremony and distance. But as the months passed, the pattern darkened. The transition from animals to people was not announced. It happened in the silent corridors of palace rumor, in the gaps between what was recorded and what was whispered. A guard who had angered him by speaking too loudly during an imperial procession was dismissed and disappeared from the palace grounds. A low-ranking courtier who fumbled the recitation of a poem found himself stripped of title and exiled without trial. By the time such incidents reached the ears of the senior ministers, they were framed not as crimes of cruelty, but as necessary corrections to preserve imperial dignity. For even those who sensed the danger in this growing impulsiveness hesitated to oppose it directly, aware that to do so was to invite the same fate. The Fujiwara regents, while still confident in their ability to manage him, began to notice that he was less inclined to wait for their counsel before speaking, that he listened to their advice with a polite detachment that did not always translate into obedience, and that the court, though still officially under their control, was beginning to look to the emperor himself for cues on how to behave. There is a particular diary entry from this period, attributed to a court lady whose family had served the palace for generations, in which she describes watching the young emperor during a festival, his face illuminated by torchlight as he observed a troupe of dancers, and noting that his expression was not one of joy or appreciation, but of calculation, as if he were imagining what it would be like to decide in that very moment which of them would be allowed to continue and which would be stopped forever. Whether this was poetic exaggeration or an accurate reading of his thoughts, it captures the sense, growing among those who knew him, that his enjoyment of power was no longer confined to the pageantry of rule, but extended to its sharpest edge. The most telling sign that his understanding of authority had shifted came when he began to bypass formal channels entirely, sending for guards or messengers directly rather than through his ministers, delivering instructions in person rather than allowing them to be filtered through protocol, and rewarding those who obeyed him instantly with gifts, promotions, or public praise. This erosion of the established order did not yet constitute open defiance of the Fujiwara, but it was a signal that the emperor was beginning to imagine himself as more than a ceremonial figure. For a boy of his age, the speed with which these impulses took hold was extraordinary, but perhaps inevitable. In a world where every whim was met with deference, where the lives of others could be altered with a single word, and where the consequences of his actions rarely touched him directly, it was natural, if dangerous, that he would begin to view those around him not as individuals with their own purposes, but as pieces in a game whose only rules were those he cared to enforce. It is here, in the quiet but unmistakable shift from guided ruler to self-directed sovereign, that the seeds of what would later be called his madness were sown. Though the term, in the language of his time, did not carry the nuance of illness, but the blunt force of condemnation. By the close of his third year on the throne, those who once saw in Yōzei a pliable child now saw something harder to predict and more difficult to control. A sovereign who had tasted the sweetness of absolute power and found it intoxicating, who understood that fear could be as effective a tool as affection, and who was beginning to wonder just how far that fear could carry him. By the time the plum blossoms of another spring began to scatter across the courtyards of the Heian palace, the air inside those lacquered halls had shifted almost imperceptibly from the warmth of calculated indulgence to the chill of quiet alarm. For what had once been dismissed as the harmless excesses of a boy emperor was now becoming an unpredictable force that even the most seasoned courtiers found themselves unable to anticipate. And in a court where every gesture was weighed for meaning, the smallest sign of unease was enough to set entire factions on edge. The Fujiwara, long accustomed to ruling from behind the curtain, had always believed that their careful web of regents, tutors, and chamberlains could contain any imperial eccentricity. But the stories circulating through the palaces in low voices were beginning to suggest otherwise. Accounts of Yōzei summoning servants in the dead of night to demand the recitation of obscure poems, only to punish those who stumbled over a verse. Of imperial hunts staged not in the open fields, but within the carefully manicured palace gardens, where frightened animals were driven into corners so the emperor could watch their panic at close range. Of sudden, unannounced inspections of the guard, during which even the smallest infraction could result in immediate dismissal or worse. It was not that violence itself was alien to the court. This was an era in which executions, punishments, and military campaigns were part of the fabric of governance, but rather that the violence now emanating from the throne seemed untethered from necessity or policy, as if it existed not to maintain order, but to satisfy a private appetite. The older ministers, men who had survived decades of shifting alliances, began to recognize in Yōzei's actions the dangerous combination of absolute power and adolescent impulse, a mixture that could not be reliably steered and could, if left unchecked, destabilize the very structure upon which their authority rested. Beyond the palace gates, the rumors took on a sharper edge. In the market streets of Heian, where gossip traveled faster than the court's official proclamations, people began whispering about the mad boy emperor who found amusement in the suffering of others. And while such tales were often embellished by storytellers eager to entertain, the kernel of truth within them was enough to plant a subtle fear among the populace. Peasants and merchants alike may have had no direct contact with the sovereign, yet they understood the dangerous logic of power. That cruelty at the top could seep downwards, legitimizing cruelty at every level. Inside the imperial compound, the atmosphere grew taut. Courtiers no longer lingered in the emperor's presence longer than required. Attendants perfected the art of moving silently, avoiding his gaze unless directly addressed. Even the regents, whose authority was second only to his, began to exchange wary glances during council sessions when Yōzei interrupted proceedings with a command or question that revealed not just impatience, but a will to bypass their mediation entirely. The balance that had been so carefully maintained since his accession, child ruler, adult handlers, was tilting, and though the shift was gradual, its trajectory was unmistakable. The Fujiwara were not naive. They knew that allowing the perception of imperial instability to spread unchecked was a threat not only to the dynasty's dignity, but to their own position as the guardians of that dignity. For if the throne became a source of chaos, the public's faith in the entire system of governance could erode. Behind closed doors, in rooms lit only by a single oil lamp and perfumed faintly with the lingering smoke of incense burned for the ancestors, they began to speak openly of options that only months earlier would have been unthinkable. The possibility of removing the emperor from daily governance, of transferring certain powers to a council, even. Though this was voiced only in the most guarded tones, the possibility of replacing him altogether. Such conversations were dangerous. To speak of dethroning the emperor was to flirt with accusations of treason, and so the language they used was oblique, wrapped in metaphors and historical parallels. They recalled past emperors who had retired early for the good of the realm, sovereigns who had chosen to devote themselves to spiritual contemplation rather than the burdens of rule. And in these carefully chosen precedents lay the outline of a plan, a bloodless coup masked as a dutiful act of preservation. Meanwhile, Yōzei, whether through instinct or the subtle cues of those around him, seemed to sense the shifting currents, and his behavior in response was unpredictable. At times, he appeared oblivious, throwing himself into elaborate horseback displays or commissioning grand banquets at which poets and musicians competed for his favor. At other times, he displayed flashes of a sharper awareness, making pointed remarks about loyalty, asking after the whereabouts of absent courtiers, or unexpectedly rewarding those who had been marginalized by the Fujiwara, as if to cultivate his own network of supporters. This duality, boyish extravagance one day, calculated maneuvering the next, only deepened the sense of unease among his handlers, for it suggested that his unpredictability was not merely a symptom of youth, but perhaps a tool he was learning to wield. The tension came to a head during a spring festival meant to honor the changing of the seasons. Traditionally, such events were opportunities for the emperor to embody harmony, to move among his subjects with grace and measured words. But that year, Yōzei disrupted the carefully choreographed proceedings by halting the procession midway and ordering a sudden contest between two of his guards. An impromptu display of martial skill that ended when one of the men was injured, and the emperor, laughing, declared the other the victor without so much as a glance at the wounded. The incident, witnessed by both court and commoners, spread quickly through the capital, and though no official reprimand was issued, the murmurs among the ministers became more urgent. By the close of that season, the palace had grown colder, not in temperature but in spirit. Conversations hushed when the emperor entered. The music of court gatherings took on a cautious, subdued tone, and the once fluid movements of attendants became rigid with the awareness that a single misstep could draw imperial attention in the worst possible way. It was in this climate, part fear, part calculation, that the Fujiwara began to prepare in earnest for what they now saw as inevitable. The removal of a ruler who had ceased to be a symbol of stability and had instead become a source of volatility that threatened them all. They would not act rashly. The Heian court was a place where even the most decisive actions were draped in the garments of ceremony and precedent. But the decision, once formed in their minds, was as irreversible as the turning of the seasons and in the stillness of the palace nights. As the wind rattled the paper screens and the faint echo of the emperor's laughter carried from distant chambers, the great game of power began its slow, deliberate turn against the very boy it had once enthroned. By the time the first chill of autumn began to settle over Heian, curling the edges of the maple leaves into shades of copper and red, the courtiers who had once whispered cautiously about the emperor's unpredictability now spoke in still more guarded tones of something deeper and far less manageable. For Yōzei's behavior had shifted from the merely erratic to the unsettlingly irrational, displaying patterns that defied the measured rhythms of court life and undermined the fragile scaffolding of ritual and decorum upon which the imperial image depended, until even those who had prided themselves on their ability to navigate any temperament found themselves treading uncertain ground. It began, as such transformations often do, with small dissonances, moments when the emperor's expression would harden without warning in the midst of an otherwise genial conversation, when his laughter at a court poem would linger a fraction too long, sharp enough to make the poet falter, when his eyes, once merely watchful, began to fix on people with a gaze so intense that they seemed to shrink beneath it. But soon these moments multiplied, spilling into the public ceremonies that were meant to display his poise. So that a festival meant to honor the harvest might end with an abrupt dismissal of the musicians for playing a tune he claimed summoned bad spirits, or a council meeting could be derailed by his sudden insistence on discussing the color of a minor official's robes rather than the petition at hand. The courtiers, trained in the art of concealment, adapted as best they could, smoothing over these disruptions with polite laughter or swift changes of subject. But there were some episodes that could not be masked so easily. There is a record in the diary of Fujiwara no Mototsune, his chief regent, of a morning audience during which the emperor, without provocation, ordered 2 attendants to be bound and interrogated for plotting to poison the imperial horses, an accusation that proved baseless but was carried out nonetheless. The cries of the bewildered servants echoing down the corridor as the court sat frozen in silence. On another occasion, Yōzei abruptly halted the reading of a diplomatic letter from a provincial governor to demand that the messenger kneel before him and repeat the message in a louder voice, then laughed when the man's voice broke with fear. These were not the calculated cruelties of a political purge, nor the cold, deliberate punishments of a ruler seeking to consolidate power. Such acts, however harsh, could at least be rationalized as the tools of governance. Rather, they seemed to arise from impulses unmoored from reason, as if the emperor's mind were now a landscape where storms could gather without warning and break over anyone unfortunate enough to stand in their path. What made the situation still more perilous was Yōzei's growing conviction that his will was sanctioned not only by the authority of the throne, but by the direct favor of the kami themselves. In his more lucid moments, he spoke of dreams in which ancestral spirits had charged him with purging the court of hidden rot. In his darker moods, he hinted that those who opposed him were defying not merely their sovereign, but the gods. Such declarations, in a culture where the emperor's divine lineage was a cornerstone of legitimacy, could not be openly disputed, yet they unnerved even the most devout, for they suggested that he no longer distinguished between divine mandate and personal impulse. At times, his belief in his own invulnerability took on an almost theatrical quality. He would ride through the palace grounds without escort, daring any spirit or mortal to harm him, or stage elaborate archery contests in which he alone was permitted to take the final shot, declaring afterwards that the gods had guided his hand. During one particularly strange episode, he insisted on presiding over a mock trial in which he played both judge and accused, delivering a rambling self-defense that ended in a self-issued pardon, to the polite but strained applause of the courtiers summoned to witness it. The palace, once a place of ordered ritual, became an environment charged with tension, where every summons from the emperor carried a hint of dread, and every gathering could veer suddenly from ceremony into chaos. Attendants learned to read the smallest shifts in his mood, the angle of his shoulders, the cadence of his speech, and to retreat discreetly when they sensed the onset of one of his unpredictable turns. Ministers began arriving at council sessions with contingency plans for steering discussions back to safe topics. Yet even their practiced diplomacy could not fully contain the undercurrent of instability that now surrounded the throne. It is worth noting that the concept of mental illness, as it might be understood today, had no place in the Heian court's framework of thought. There were words for madness, but they were steeped in moral and spiritual judgment, suggesting possession, impurity, or divine punishment rather than a condition to be diagnosed and treated. Thus, the response to the emperor's behavior was shaped not by a desire to understand or heal, but by the imperative to protect the court and themselves from its consequences. This meant that rather than confronting him directly, the regents and senior ministers began to work around him, quietly redirecting responsibilities, postponing decisions until his attention waned, and, in private, exploring ways to remove him without provoking the wrath of the gods or the outrage of loyalists. Yet even as their patience thinned, there remained a certain awe in their apprehension. For Yōzei, in his volatility, embodied the paradox at the heart of the imperial institution. The emperor was at once the source of all order and the potential cause of its undoing, his person both sacred and dangerously human. To acknowledge his flaws too openly was to risk undermining the very myth that sustained the throne. To ignore them was to invite disaster. And so the court moved forward on a knife's edge, each day a delicate balance between maintaining the fiction of imperial infallibility and shielding the realm from the reality that its sovereign's mind was no longer entirely his own. By the close of that year, the whispers had solidified into a quiet consensus among those who mattered. The emperor could not be allowed to continue unchecked. The question was no longer whether to act, but how and when, and whether it could be done in such a way that the boy who had once been the unifying symbol of two great powers would not, in his removal, fracture the delicate web of alliances that bound the court together. It was a question whose answer would soon come, not in the form of a public reckoning or a violent coup, but in an act of calculated erasure, one that would leave the throne gleaming in the winter sunlight while quietly removing the hand that had, for 8 turbulent years, rested upon it. It happened not in the chaos of clashing swords or the smoke of burning gates, but in the still, deliberate manner that only the Heian court, with its centuries of honed subtlety, could devise. A removal so carefully choreographed that it left no wound upon the palace walls, and yet severed, with final precision, the bond between a sovereign and his throne. By the opening months of 8884, the Fujiwara had reached the conclusion that had long been approaching. Their private deliberations now hardened into a course of action. Each step planned with the same attention to ceremony that governed the planting of imperial gardens or the recitation of ancestral rites. For in this world of lacquer and silk, even the destruction of a reign had to be wrapped in the appearance of harmony. The plan began with the manipulation of absence. Audiences that might once have placed the emperor at the center of deliberations were quietly canceled or rescheduled without his knowledge. Petitions requiring his signature were delayed until his interest in them waned. And the most pressing matters of state were discussed in small, private meetings to which he was not invited. His world, once stretching from the gilded council chambers to the festival processions in the city, began to contract. The corridors he walked growing shorter. The faces he saw fewer, until he was left surrounded mainly by attendants whose loyalty lay more with the regents than with him. Fujiwara no Mototsune, the architect of this quiet coup, understood that any overt display of force would risk both the dignity of the court and the perception of divine order. And so he framed the act not as an overthrow, but as a necessary act of preservation. To the other senior ministers, he spoke of the emperor's burden, of the strain that governance placed upon his health, of the compassionate duty to relieve him of such pressures before they did irreparable harm to his spirit. To the priests and spiritual advisors, he murmured of omens, of dreams in which the kami had hinted that the time for the emperor's retreat into contemplation was near. In a society where precedent was everything, he summoned the memory of past sovereigns who had stepped aside in favor of older, steadier hands, and thus transformed what might have been an act of defiance into one of filial piety toward the realm itself. The chosen day was one of pale winter sunlight, when the palace gardens lay stripped of blossom and the wind carried the faint scent of snow from the northern hills. Yōzei was summoned to a small, private audience under the pretense of discussing preparations for a spring festival, a subject calculated to lower his guard. The chamber was warm with brazier heat, the paper screens casting soft shadows across the tatami. And those in attendance were few. The regent, Mototsune, 2 senior ministers whose loyalty to the Fujiwara was beyond question, and a pair of attendants who had served the emperor since boyhood. Their presence meant to suggest continuity rather than rupture. It was Mototsune who spoke first, his voice measured, each syllable wrapped in the silk of courtly courtesy. He spoke of the emperor's youth, of the weight of the sacred crown upon one so young, of the rare opportunity for him to withdraw from the burdens of politics and devote himself to the higher callings of poetry, art, and communion with the divine. He did not use the word abdication, for such bluntness had no place here. Instead, he spoke of passing the torch to one whose years and experience better suited the turbulent times. The chosen successor, Emperor Koko, was an older prince, a man with neither the youth to threaten nor the ambition to disrupt the Fujiwara order, and thus presented as the safest of harbors for the ship of state. Yōzei, caught between the ceremony's gentleness and its inescapable meaning, is said to have sat in silence for a long while, his gaze drifting toward the winter light filtering through the paper screens. Whether he understood, in that moment, the full finality of what was being proposed, or whether he believed it could yet be reversed, is uncertain. For the chronicles preserve only the outward signs: a slight tightening of his jaw, a nod that could have been resignation, or the reflex of someone schooled from infancy to agree when surrounded by his elders. There was no outburst, no accusation, no demand for loyalty from those in the room. Perhaps he sensed that the battle, if there had ever been one, had already been lost in meetings to which he had never been invited. The formal act took place within hours, in a smaller hall away from the public gaze, where the sacred regalia, the mirror, the sword, the jewel, were symbolically transferred to the new sovereign. The court chroniclers, bound by the conventions of their craft, recorded the moment with the same serene detachment they might use to describe the changing of a season, omitting entirely the currents of fear, relief, and uncertainty that must have run beneath the still surface. Outside the palace, the city carried on with its daily rhythms. The coup, if it could be called that, left no bodies in the street, no fires in the night, and yet its impact was as decisive as if the gates had been taken by force. When it was over, Yōzei was led not to a cell or an exile's hut, but to a residence within the imperial compound, a gesture meant to preserve both his dignity and the appearance of familial harmony. He retained the trappings of honor, his title, his servants, his gardens, but none of the levers of power. In this way, the Fujiwara ensured that he would be seen not as a dethroned ruler to be rallied around, but as a figure removed from the game, a player politely ushered off the board while the pieces continued to move without him. To those who had orchestrated it, the success of the operation lay precisely in its absence of drama. There was no single act for history to magnify into legend, no martyrdom to inspire resistance, only the quiet fact that one day the emperor ruled, and the next day he did not. Yet for Yōzei himself, the absence of violence may have made the loss more surreal. For in his experience, power had always been an active, visible force, something seized or defended in decisive moments. To have it vanish in the softness of a winter afternoon, carried away by words wrapped in courtesy, must have been a bewilderment from which no amount of silk cushions or perfumed gardens could entirely distract him. And so the Chrysanthemum Throne, which had once been the center of his world, receded from view, its golden surface gleaming now for another. While he remained within the same palace walls, close enough to remember, but too far to reclaim, it was the most refined kind of defeat, one in which the victor leaves the vanquished still seated in comfort, but stripped of the one thing that made all the rest meaningful. In the days following his quiet removal from the Chrysanthemum Throne, Yōzei's world contracted into a pattern of walls, corridors, and carefully managed gardens, a space so delicately appointed and so meticulously maintained that, to an outsider, it might have seemed the very picture of privilege. Yet for the man who had once ruled from the center of an empire, it was a gilded enclosure, a place where every comfort was balanced by an invisible chain. His new residence lay within the larger imperial compound, close enough for him to hear, on certain mornings, the distant echo of ceremonial drums or the faint murmur of court processions, reminders that the machinery of state still turned without him. but far enough removed that those sounds carried the flatness of memory rather than the immediacy of command. The Fujiwara, masters of appearances, ensured that no shadow of disgrace clung to him in the official record. He retained the formal address of an emperor, his name invoked in rituals and listed in the genealogies as though nothing had changed. His chambers were adorned with the same lacquered screens, the same embroidered silks, the same seasonal arrangements of plum blossoms or chrysanthemums that he had known before. And his servants bowed with the same precise angle, speaking with the same careful inflections. Yet these surfaces concealed the absence of what truly mattered. No envoys came seeking his judgment. No petitions were placed before him to sign. And no ministers entered his rooms except for the most perfunctory visits, their conversation hovering always on the safe ground of weather, poetry, or the health of the palace horses. In this strange twilight between honor and exile, Yōzei moved through his days like a man studying the edges of an invisible map. He could walk the gardens that had been designed for his pleasure, their winding paths leading past koi ponds and stands of bamboo that whispered in the wind. Yet he could not step beyond the gate without formal permission. He could order the kitchen to prepare a feast of his choosing. Yet the guest list was always arranged by others, ensuring that no gathering became a council and no friendship grew into a faction. He could write letters, but they were carried by attendants whose routes passed first through the offices of the regent's staff. There were moments when the sheer softness of his confinement seemed almost designed to dull his will, to wrap him in so many layers of silk and ceremony that he might forget what it was to give an order that would ripple across provinces. The days were punctuated by diversions meant to occupy his mind. Poetry readings with minor courtiers, visits from musicians, excursions into the palace's hunting park under watchful eyes. Yet beneath these curated pleasures ran a current of watchfulness so constant it was almost invisible. A quiet assurance that every word he spoke, every gesture he made, was observed, noted, and, if necessary, reported. For Yōzei, whose brief reign had been marked by an unfiltered access to the levers of power, the shift from absolute sovereignty to ornamental seclusion was not merely a loss of authority, but a profound dislocation of self. At times he seemed to accept it with the detachment of a man studying his own life from a distance, as if the boy emperor were a figure in a story told about someone else. At other times, the old impulses surfaced. Sudden commands to his attendants, abrupt changes to the order of a feast, sharp rebukes to those who displeased him. These flashes of imperiousness were tolerated so long as they remained confined to the walls of his residence, harmless exercises of a sovereignty that no longer extended beyond the threshold. The courtiers who were sent to keep him company learned to navigate these moods with the same skill they might employ in handling a volatile guest, indulging harmless whims, steering conversation away from politics, feigning ignorance when he asked after the doings of ministers or the affairs of distant provinces. Some found in him a certain charm when he was at ease, for he could still display the grace and wit that had once captivated audiences at court festivals. Others, however, saw in his silences and sudden bursts of intensity the lingering presence of the ruler he had been, and perhaps the ruler he might have become, had events unfolded differently. The outside world, meanwhile, adjusted quickly to his absence from power. The people of Heian, for whom emperors were often distant, symbolic figures, accepted the change with the same resigned pragmatism with which they met the turning of the seasons. The new sovereign presided over ceremonies, the Fujiwara tightened their control over governance, and Yōzei became, in the public imagination, a figure half-remembered, still alive, still honored in name, but no longer a force in the living present. Within his enclosure, however, time seemed to move differently. Days bled into one another with the quiet regularity of the temple bell. And the markers of change were subtle. The first frost on the chrysanthemums, the shift in the wind that carried the scent of rain, the occasional announcement of a court wedding or a birth to which he was not invited. In these moments, the gulf between his ceremonial status and his actual isolation widened, until the very trappings meant to honor him began to feel like a mockery. And yet, there is no record of him attempting escape, no hint of a plot to reclaim the throne. Whether this was because he understood the futility of such efforts, or because he had come to prefer the safety of his golden cage to the dangers of court politics, history does not say. What it does record is that he remained in this state of suspended authority for years, moving through the palace gardens like a shadow among the living, a man who had once been the embodiment of imperial power and was now its ghost. In the evenings, as the light faded and the servants lit the lamps one by one, Yōzei would sometimes sit alone in the veranda overlooking the pond, watching the koi stir the water into ripples that caught the reflections of the lanterns. Perhaps he saw in those ripples the distorted echo of the world he had once ruled. A reminder that even when the surface seemed calm, movement and change could never be wholly stilled. But if such thoughts passed through his mind, they left no trace in the chronicles. For the record of these years is sparse, filled more with the silence of what was not done than with the noise of what was. And so his life in this gilded confinement unfolded year after year, until the young man who had been deposed in a winter afternoon became an older man, remembered only for the turbulence of his youth, his presence tolerated, his power forgotten, and the golden cage around him polished so brightly that those who looked from the outside might almost believe it was a palace. The years after Yōzei's removal from the Chrysanthemum Throne did not unfold like the fall of a stone into water, with ripples radiating outward until they faded. Instead, they stretched like a long, unbroken thread, disappearing into a dark loom, each day woven almost indistinguishably into the next, until decades had passed and the boy emperor, once the axis around which the Heian court spun, became little more than a faint outline in the tapestry of his own time. In the palace records, his name still appeared in the proper places, recited during rituals, listed among the living members of the imperial family, but always as a ceremonial presence, a figure whose reality existed at the edges of power, neither wholly absent nor meaningfully involved. Outside his residence, the Fujiwara-controlled court moved forward as if his reign were a chapter written in haste and politely set aside. Successive emperors took the throne, presiding over festivals and pronouncing decrees in voices shaped and guided by the same regency system that had once placed Yōzei in power. The machinery of state turned smoothly without him, and in that smoothness lay the most complete form of erasure. There was no gap for him to fill, no crisis to recall him to prominence, no lingering faction daring to speak of his return. It was as though his removal had not been a disruption, but a correction, a return to the intended order of things. Within the high walls of his gilded confinement, the seasons became his truest calendar. Spring arrived with the pale pink of plum blossoms drifting into the pond. Summer brought the shimmer of cicadas in the heat. Autumn painted the maples crimson and gold. Winter laid frost upon the lacquered railings of his veranda. These changes of nature marked the passing of time more reliably than any political event in which he might once have participated. Occasionally, news from beyond his enclosure reached him in carefully filtered fragments. The appointment of a new regent, a distant rebellion suppressed, a marriage alliance forged to strengthen the Fujiwara's hold on power. These announcements came without request, slipped into conversation by attendants whose task was to keep him informed just enough to prevent the appearance of ignorance, but never enough to tempt him into political thought. Yet for all the constraints around him, the habits of a ruler could not be entirely erased. There were moments, rare but memorable to those who served him, when Yōzei would summon a servant or companion and question them about the price of rice in the markets, the condition of the roads in the provinces, the behavior of governors whose names he had not spoken aloud in years. Such questions, answered cautiously, might be followed by a long silence in which he seemed to measure the gap between knowing and acting, between possessing information and possessing the means to use it. Sometimes he would simply nod, as if filing the knowledge away. Other times, his eyes would narrow briefly, a flicker of the boy who had once believed a single command could shape the world. As the years passed, his features changed in the way that the faces of emperors rarely do in the public imagination. Deprived of the daily exposure that keeps sovereigns fixed in the minds of their subjects, his hair silvered without ceremony, his posture bent not by the weight of state, but by the slow erosion of time and the sharpness of youth, gave way to the quiet endurance of a man who had learned that survival often depends less on action than on patience. The servants who had attended him since his enthronement grew old alongside him, replaced by younger faces who knew him only as the former emperor. Their respect for him shaped more by protocol than by personal memory. In the city beyond the palace gates, his name faded from common speech. The generation that had whispered about his erratic reign gave way to one for whom he was a curiosity mentioned in passing, a reminder that emperors could be removed, but the system endured. Among the storytellers who entertained crowds in the markets, fragments of his life became woven into moral tales. Cautionary fables about the dangers of unchecked power, or, in some versions, about the folly of youth elevated too soon. These stories, embroidered over time, bore only a passing resemblance to the events they claimed to recount. Yet they ensured that his name survived not in the precision of history, but in the shifting realm of rumor and allegory. The court itself maintained a deliberate silence. Official chronicles, bound in silk and kept in lacquered chests, referred to his reign in brief, bloodless terms, speaking of the year of his accession, the year of his abdication, and little else. His deeds, whether feared or celebrated in private memory, were absorbed into the formal narrative in which emperors were eternal symbols, not flawed men. This erasure was itself a form of judgment. To be remembered vividly was to remain dangerous, but to be forgotten, truly forgotten, was to be rendered harmless. For Yōzei, the decades must have seemed both interminable and strangely compressed. Each day a repetition of the last, yet also a marker in the slow procession toward an ending he could neither hasten nor escape. In the evenings, when the light turned to amber and the gardens cast long shadows across the gravel paths, he would sometimes sit for hours without speaking, his gaze fixed on some point beyond the visible horizon. Whether he was recalling the days when that horizon was his to command, or imagining a future in which it might be again, no one could say. For he rarely spoke of the past, and when he did, it was with the oblique detachment of someone recounting another man's life. This, perhaps, was the final irony of his long survival, that in outliving his reign by more than 6 decades, he became both a living relic of a moment the court preferred to forget, and the quiet proof that the man and the office are not the same. The throne had been taken from him without drawing a drop of blood, yet the separation was as complete as death. In the great hall where emperors received their subjects, another's voice had long since replaced his. In the records where emperors' reigns were inscribed, his had been neatly closed and bound. And in the city whose people once bowed at the mention of his name, His presence lingered only as an echo faint enough to be drowned by the turning of the seasons. And so he remained, decade after decade, a shadow cast by the light of a throne he could no longer approach. A figure neither entirely in exile nor entirely at home, honored in form, ignored in substance, living proof that to be spared in politics is not always to be spared in truth. In the end, his greatest act as a deposed ruler was simply to endure, to watch the empire move on without him, and to carry, in the privacy of his own mind, the memory of a crown that had once seemed eternal and had vanished, in the span of a winter afternoon, into the hands of another. By the autumn of 949, the man who had once been crowned in silks too heavy for his boyish shoulders was no longer the fierce-eyed youth who had startled courtiers with unpredictable commands, nor even the watchful, silver-haired recluse who walked the gravel paths of his enclosed gardens. He was an old man of 80, his body diminished by years of quiet confinement, his voice softened to the point that even those sitting near him had to lean forward to catch his words. And his presence, though still greeted with bows, had become that of a figure more ceremonial than consequential, a living chapter of the past who now seemed to exist solely because time, for reasons of its own, had not yet claimed him. The end, when it came, was as unceremonious as the long years that preceded it. There was no sudden illness to rouse the palace into anxious activity, no dramatic decline that brought ministers to his bedside. Rather, his health simply ebbed, the way a tide recedes so gradually that only the patient watcher notices the water no longer reaches the same mark on the sand. Servants observed that he ate less, that he slept more, that his daily walks became shorter, confined to the nearest veranda where he could watch the pond without descending the steps. On some days, he seemed content to sit in silence for hours, his eyes tracking the slow movement of the koi, as though their circling mirrored the loops of his own life, returning again and again to the same points without ever breaking free. When word reached the regent's household that the former emperor's condition had worsened, the response was measured rather than urgent. Messengers were sent to ensure his attendants followed the proper rituals for the care of an imperial person. Priests were summoned to offer prayers to the kami, and the physicians on duty made their way to his chambers with the quiet efficiency of men who understood that the outcome was beyond their art. There is no record of any great gathering at his side, no account of heirs or ministers leaning in to hear final words of counsel. In truth, Yōzei had long since been absent from the affairs of state, and the machinery of governance, so smooth in its workings, felt no tremor in his impending departure. On the 23rd day of the 10th month, under a sky veiled by thin autumn clouds, Emperor Yōzei exhaled for the last time. The chronicles record the moment with a single unadorned sentence, its tone no different than that used to note the passing of a distant official. The former emperor passed away at the age of 80. No mention is made of who was present, of whether his eyes were open or closed, of whether he spoke before the end. The man who had once commanded without question, whose whims could alter the lives of courtiers and commoners alike, left the world with the same quiet in which he had been politically buried 65 years earlier. The funeral rites, when they came, were conducted according to the letter of imperial protocol, but stripped of the grandeur afforded to reigning sovereigns. There was no great procession through the capital, no assembly of the full court in resplendent dress. Instead, the ceremony was confined to the inner precincts of the palace, attended by a select circle of officials and relatives, the prayers offered by priests echoing softly against the lacquered pillars. His body was prepared in the traditional manner, wrapped in layers of fine white cloth, placed within a coffin of cedar whose fragrance mingled with the incense smoke. The bier, though dignified, was modest, lacking the gilded embellishments that marked the funerals of those who had died upon the throne. Outside the palace, life in Heian went on without pause. The markets bustled with traders haggling over the season's produce. Poets gathered to compose verses about the turning leaves, and the court, under the reign of the current emperor, continued its cycle of ceremonies and audiences, as though the death of the man who had once sat in their place was an event of minor consequence. To the common people, the news was little more than a passing curiosity. An emperor from long ago, gone at last after decades of seclusion. For many, he had been a name learned in childhood and then half forgotten. A story told by older relatives about the boy who became emperor too young and was removed before he could grow old in power. In the official records, his passing was noted with the proper posthumous titles, his name added to the long line of imperial ancestors. Yet even in death, the brevity of his entry was telling. It was as though his life had been reduced to 2 points on a timeline: the year of his enthronement and the year of his abdication, with the long expanse between and after treated as a void not worth filling. This was the final quiet triumph of the Fujiwara's design, that the man they had once removed without blood should remain, even in memory, a faint and harmless figure, stripped of the power to inspire loyalty or rebellion. If there was grief, it was the private grief of those few who had served him through the long decades of his seclusion, attendants who had known him as more than the sum of his reputation, men and women who had seen the flicker of sharp intelligence in his gaze, who had shared moments of humor or kindness hidden from the public eye. For them, his death may have carried the weight of the closing of a long, strange chapter, the quiet end of a life that had been both privileged and confined, revered and ignored. But theirs was not the grief of a nation. It was the grief of a household losing its central figure, however diminished that figure had been. And so, on an unremarkable autumn day, the former emperor was laid to rest. His grave marked according to custom, but not celebrated with monuments or grand memorials. The wind moved through the trees, carrying away the scent of incense, and the palace gates closed once more on the business of the present. In the great sweep of history, his death was a small note in the margin, a final punctuation to a life that had been written, erased, and then allowed to fade into the texture of the past. For Yōzei, there was no aftershock, no resurgence of his name in the political currents of the court. He had been gone from power for so long that his physical death felt less like a departure than the confirmation of an absence everyone had already learned to live with. And in that way, he achieved a kind of ultimate anonymity rare for one born to the throne. He left no lingering disputes over his legacy, no battles over his memory, only the quiet fact of his existence, which had begun in a crown and ended in a shroud, with the long stretch between defined more by what he had been prevented from doing than by what he had done. Looking back across the arc of Yōzei's life, it is tempting to leave him where history has placed him. An emperor whose reign descended into violence, whose mind was marked as unstable, whose throne was taken in silence rather than in battle. But to do so is to flatten him into a cautionary figure, a parable about the dangers of youth and the seductions of power, and to forget that behind the title and the axe there was, from the very beginning, a child caught in a machinery far older and colder than he could have understood. The court of the Heian era was a place where the human self was always in danger of being consumed by the role it was made to play. And Yōzei was given the most dangerous role of all at an age when his understanding of consequence could not match the reach of his authority. A boy of 7, lifted onto the Chrysanthemum Throne, surrounded by adults whose primary loyalty was not to him, but to the factions they served, was not simply being given power. He was being used as a vessel through which others could exercise their own. In that sense, His earliest acts were not the raw expression of a tyrant, but the awkward and sometimes cruel experiments of someone who had been handed an infinite field without a map or compass. What followed? His growing taste for unchecked command, the impulsive punishments, the fascination with life and death, was both the result of his own temperament and the failure of the system around him. In a society that had no framework for understanding or supporting mental health, erratic behavior was either feared, manipulated, or punished, and it was rarely treated with compassion. Yōzei's volatility became a liability not because the court suddenly discovered cruelty, but because cruelty unmoored from political calculation was something they could neither predict nor control. When the Fujiwara decided to remove him, they did so with the same cold elegance they applied to every shift of power. No armies, no open defiance, just the quiet tightening of the circle until he could be displaced without protest. And yet, in sparing his life, they sentenced him to a long, slow form of erasure. For 65 years, he lived within sight of the throne he had once occupied, watching seasons and sovereigns change, knowing that nothing he did could alter the course of the realm. It is easy to see this as mercy, but there is a cruelty in survival without agency, in being kept as a living reminder of both what you were and what you will never be again. Perhaps the most human truth in his story is that he endured. He did not die young in a blaze of rebellion, nor did he vanish into exile. He stayed year after year within the palace walls until time itself became the final act of separation between the man and the role he had once played. By the time he died at 80, the boy emperor was a figure most had only heard about, a story passed down without the immediacy of memory. And so Yōzei's life leaves us with questions that echo beyond the Heian court. What happens when a child is given the power to command before they are old enough to understand the weight of those commands? What responsibility falls on those who shape, shield, or exploit that child? And how much of a person's legacy is decided not by their actions, but by how the people in power choose to remember or forget them? In the end, Yōzei's reign is not just the story of a boy who ruled and fell. It is a mirror held up to the fragility of human judgment when surrounded by absolute authority, and to the systems that can both create and quietly dismantle an emperor without ever admitting their own role in the rise or the ruin. His life reminds us that in history, as in life, power without guidance is as dangerous as guidance without compassion. If you've stayed with me through this journey into the shadows of the Heian court, through the silks and the whispers, the command and the confinement, consider joining us as we uncover more lives that history has tried to fold away. Subscribe to Dark Ages Unveiled, and together we'll keep walking into the forgotten corridors of the past, where every closed door hides a story still worth telling.